Okay, good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
And I wink to the few people online that have been waiting. I told them I would wink. So I welcome you all. My name is Rabbi Jacobson, and welcome to another Wednesday night live, titled Betraying Yourself, or Betraying Your Promised Land. So last week I discussed one of the saddest experiences in life. Not necessarily tragic, but sad. I mean, there are many sad experiences, losses, deaths, and unfortunately all kinds of other, sometimes senseless misfortunes. But on a psychological, personal level, and maybe an enduring level, one of the sad things we discussed last week, which was shattered dreams and broken promises and unrealized expectations. In a sense, can we reclaim heaven after it seems to have been lost? And that was a sense of discussion that followed Shavuot, when heaven and earth met. So post that experience, you want to regain, you want to make sure you maintain that connection. And we all know that it's the real challenge is not inspiration itself, but maintaining it. So though it may be difficult for some of us to get inspired, but when you do, the real challenge is, can you maintain it? How long will it last before it dissipates? And that's true with all magical moments. So in that ongoing theme, there's another very sad experience, and that is even deeper than someone else's promises to you that have been broken. You know, someone that you thought that you loved and they loved you, and that seems to have disappeared. And the other experiences we discussed last week is something even more profound, and maybe even at the root of it all, which is betraying yourself. Now, some of you may not know what I'm talking about. Some of you may very well fully know what I talk about. So let me explain it for those that need explanation. We all start out life innocent and unjaded and unsoiled by we call life's challenges, sometimes life's cruelty. So when we're young children are in a type of cocoon, naive world, except of course unfortunately those that have been who grow up and thrown into the battle zone, the war zone, long before they deserve to, and that is in their homes, abusive or dysfunctional homes. But even in that scenario, children growing up in healthy homes, it's in our teenage years and then later as we turn into young adults when there's a transition, and no one really knows when it happens exactly, but at some point you lose your innocence. So there's idealism, there are dreams, there are things that you fantasized even, that you would accomplish. And then as the years pass, as we age, many of these dreams, many of these ideals, many of these expectations of ourselves often don't become realized. So for many just simply dismiss it as these were dreams of a child, of someone who was idealistic and not realistic. But sometimes you wonder, maybe that wasn't the case. Maybe you actually did have something, some instinct about what you're capable of and of your potential, and it was you that betrayed yourself, that you didn't either have the courage, or you didn't have the confidence, self-confidence, or others may have weakened it, or you felt the need to conform to standards that compromise yourself. And you have to wonder what really changed. Is it something that was really unrealistic, or is that you just gave up? And when we're younger, we're more energetic and more gung-ho, a certain free abandon. As we get older, we begin to become more calculated. We're hurt more, we're more protective. We tend to take less risks. And a person who comes to the recognition that it's possible or actual that they actually betrayed themselves, is not a very easy thing to live with. Which is one of the reasons that we could argue that many of us don't want to accept that, because it's not easy to live with. Doesn't mean you haven't done it, it just means you can't really accept that you've done it. Because what does that say? If someone else hurt you, you can always blame them. But if you betrayed yourself, who do you blame for that? So this is a topic I'd like to address this evening. As usual, the Wednesday night class likes to tread in territories uncharted by others, right? Okay. What is that opening line in Star Trek? Not to visit worlds. Sorry? Right. Okay. So instead of going into outer space, we shall go into inner space. Okay. And even though perhaps it's untreaded, the truth is the teachings and the ideas I share with are not my own. They come and are based on ancient wisdom, millennia old teachings. The challenge is to apply it and to translate it to contemporary times. But the truths are universal and timeless. That's the challenge. How do you bring the timeless into the timely? Some people are connected to the timeless, but they don't know how to bring it into a timely fashion. And some people are untimely and they have no timelessness. So that's a challenge for all of us. And I would say it's part of the challenge of our getting together here as well. So, this isn't an accident why I chose this topic this week. It's because of this weekly Torah portion, which is in some way a guide or a blueprint by which we follow and we can live our lives. So as the weeks unfold in the year, so too do the chapters of the Torah unfold. And we live with the times means we live with the chapter that sheds light on the events of the time, on the psychological and cosmic energies of every particular segment of the calendar. So if you read the Bible literally and without that application, it can seem very timely, but not for our times, for biblical times. But if you know how to decipher the spiritual code and apply it to our psychological state of mind and hearts and challenges, then the timeless Torah becomes timely, which is obviously the challenge that I posed earlier. To bring that which is beyond time into time and space as we are here today. So what is this theme of this week's chapter? The betrayal of the promised land. So firstly, the literal story, which everyone can read in the actual chapter, called Shelach, is the third chapter in the book of Numbers. Third chapter in the fourth chapter. Bamidbar Nosei Ba'aleischa Shelach is the fourth chapter in the fourth book of the Torah. And the story goes briefly that the Jews had left Egypt, of course, and they then encountered, of course, the challenge at the Red Sea, or the Reed Sea. Sea parted. Then they arrived at Sinai. And if some of you following what I wrote last week, this is all a part of a 42-step journey, or 42 journeys through the wilderness. And I began a series last week, a new series on what those 42 journeys are in our own lives. So I went through the first 5 journeys, and I'll hopefully continue week by week. So on the 12th journey, that's when they arrived at Sinai. And then from Sinai, things went downhill. Up till there, everything was uphill, actually. Uphill, I mean in a good way, not difficult, but uphill as in from Egypt, Red Sea, received the Torah at Sinai. But then after Sinai, things began to sour. They built the golden calf, the people did. And then a little while later, like on the 13th or 14th journey to be exact, 14th stop since they left Egypt, the story of this week's chapter takes place. And the story is, as the Jews are preparing to enter the Promised Land, they're on their way to the Promised Land, to Israel, the Holy Land. Why is it called the Promised Land? Because it's a land that was promised by God to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And now the Jews their descendants and children were on their way toward that land. So what is done? Moses sends scouts to spy out, check out what's the best way to enter the Promised Land. And are there enemies? And if we need to go to war, what's the best way to basically scout out and get a lay of the land, as the Ramban explains, in order to know what's the easiest and best way to enter. We're talking about a large nation of people returning to the land of Israel. So Shlach Lecha Anoshim, Moses sends these scouts, and they go to check it out. And they spend a good amount of time. And then the Torah continues how they return with a terrible report. And they basically, the way the Torah says, they blasphemized the land. That's the expression used. They spoke Lashon Hara about the land, which means they came back with a report that this is a land that we cannot conquer. And they brought samples of fruit and other samples to demonstrate how the land was too materialistic, too large, too powerful. In their memorable words, not memorable, but words that resonate through history, the scouts say, Eretz Echeles Yeshvel. It's a land that consumes its inhabitants, and as such, we are unable to enter. And they create a panic in the entire camp of the Jewish people, and it becomes literally to the point where that night, the Torah tells us how they cried all night. Because here they left Egypt, and their only hope was going to the Promised Land. Where else are they going? No one wanted to stay in the desert, and they don't want to go back to Egypt. And this panic became a epidemic, basically. And there were only two men, two of the scouts, who stood up and said, no, the scouts are wrong. But the damage was done. The people heard this report, and they were terrified, and they basically began to challenge Moses and challenge God, that this is not where they want to go. They don't want to go to a land and be destroyed. And as a result, God says to them, okay, you cried all night, I'll give you something to cry about. That's the expression used. B'chiyah l'deres, tears for generations. And God says to them, you don't want to go into the land, I will fulfill your wish. And then and there, the decree was passed that everyone who left Egypt would never enter the Promised Land. They all perished in the wilderness. Not right then, but over the years. And that's when the decree, had this sin not happened, the Jews would have been in the Promised Land just in a matter of a few more days. Because of this, instead of 14 journeys, it became 42. And instead of a year or 2 years, 2.5 years, it became 40 years. And instead of everybody entering the Promised Land, they ended up perishing and dying there. Including Moses, the captain of the ship, even though he was not part of this. And the only two that actually would enter were the two men, Caleb and Yeshua and Joshua, who stood up and defended the Promised Land. They were the two that would enter. Joshua would, of course, be the leader that would inherit, and he would be the successor of Moses. And then B'chiyah l'deres, tears for generations. Why? Because on that night, that was Tisha B'Av night when they returned and when they came up with this terrible report. And Tisha B'Av from then on became the saddest day in the Jewish calendar. First and foremost because of what happened then with the scouts, but then it got worse. That same night would also be the night and the day that the Babylonians and then the Romans would destroy the first temple and the second temple. The Mishnah says 5 tragedies would befall the people on that day in Tisha B'Av. And the first is in this week's chapter. So in many ways you can say that this is a tragic chapter, a tragic episode. Yet, as many of you may be familiar as well, the Torah doesn't mince words. It's not afraid of addressing very, very terrible experiences. Of course, the objective here is not to remain there, but to learn from it. And to learn, most importantly, the lessons in our own lives. So what exactly is the story behind the story? And above all, how does it apply to us today, here, now? And the answer is really in understanding what the Promised Land really, truly is. What is the Promised Land? I mean, it's a euphemism. We use Promised Land. But what does it mean, the Promised Land? Why did God promise it to the patriarchs? And why does it remain a Promised Land till this day? We still use that term. And Israel till this day remains a holy land for so many people, not just for the Jewish people, but for nations all over the world, for major religions, all going back to that promise. What does the promise mean? What makes this land more promised than any other land in this world? So the way the mystics explain it, and there are many explanations, of course, I will address the spiritual one, which is the easiest one to apply to our lives, even though other explanations are equally legitimate, but they all add up to the personal application, and that is, promise refers to the epitome and the quintessential perfection that each of us searches for in our lives. When you say promised land, literally, what does it mean? It means that we're looking for paradise. Some people call it Eden, some people call it paradise, some people call it promised land. Many names for it. Utopia. And in a sense, in the Bible, you also have the paradise. That's also a word used, of course. Adam and Eve in the garden. And then they lose their innocence and they are banished from the garden. And the rest of life is searching for Eden. The search for Eden, the search for paradise. So the promised land, in its fullest sense of the word, is more than just a piece of geography on the map. It refers to a part of each of us that is the ultimate that you can be. So when God promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs, the promised land, he was telling them, I will give you a promise. And the promise is that you will be able to find and actualize and reach your deepest spiritual potential. So when is it first referred to, the promised land? You look in the chapter Lech Lecha, that's the first time it's referred to in the Torah. In Genesis and Bereshit, discussions more around the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, no mention is made of Israel. The same with Noah, chapter of Noah. The flood, the transmigrations, the confusion of languages. But the first time that it's mentioned, actually is not even mentioned by name. It says, God commands Abraham, Lech lecha ma'artzecha, leave your homeland, and go el ha'eretz asher areka. Go to the land that I will show you. Later, it spelled out what that land is. It was called Eretz Canaan. But as the first promise, the first time it's promised, and the first time it's seen as a country that God sets his eyes on and sends Abraham there, is in those words, El ha'eretz asher areka. Go to the land that I will show you. So whenever anything is described, it's always important to see what is the first description. And especially in the Torah, which is so precise, the first description tells you, in a sense, the essence of it. So what does this mean, the land that I will show you? Why doesn't just God say, this is Israel? It's not called Eretz Yisrael yet, called Eretz Canaan, Canaan, or whatever other name. Or they could say it's west of where you are now in southern Mesopotamia, Iraq, today modern day Iraq. There's no coordinates given, simply the so-called very vague statement, the land that I will show you. So the mystics explain, in Hasidic thought particular, that Eretz Asher Areka is referring to the land that I will show you, can also be translated in Hebrew, the land that I will show you who you are. I will show you. I will reveal the real you. So I'll go to the land, Asher Areka, where you will be revealed in your fullest sense. That's the first description. Because what it makes the land of Israel promised is not just some detached promise like, you do the right thing and I'll give you a candy called the promised land. You behave the right way, the ultimate reward is that you return to the promised land. The promised land means something much deeper. It's the promise that each of us has within ourselves that you can actualize who you truly are. So as long as Abraham would remain in his homeland, his past, trapped by, as I've discussed many times, the three forms of subjectivity of Lech Lecha, his personal biases, his personal subjectivity, the influences of his home, Beis Avicha, the home of his parents. And Maladatcha, his place of birth. Enatzecha, affected by the social peer pressure and social pressure and the need to conform, etc. As long as Abraham remained there, you don't know who you really are. Maybe you are just a product of your community. Maybe you're a product of your parents. And who are they a product of? Of their parents. Maybe you're a product of advertising. How do you know who you truly are? As long as you are under the influence of the different forces that shape us, and there are many. Generally, the Torah describes them in three, the forces that shape. One, as I said, is our own personal bias. The second is family influences and attitudes that shape us in our formative years. And three is society, social norms or social standards. So if someone asked you, or ask yourself the question, are you you? Are you an individual, independent you? Or are you some type of, what's the word for it? Product? More than product. Some form of, you say a concoction that's made of different chemicals. What is it called? Some form of a composite of forces that are not about you, but about people around you. Can you say for sure that the attitudes you have about life are yours? Or maybe that's what you picked up at home? How you react to things. Why some of us have rage inside of us and get angry. Why some of us cope in certain ways and others in other ways. Very often, whether we like it or not, and the older you get, the more you look like your mother or your father, the person you tried to run away from or disliked, at least some of their attitudes. So you start wondering, how much are you you, and how much are you a product of those before you? And not to suggest that our parents necessarily were independent, as I suggested earlier, that they too can be. It's like the blind leading the blind. One vicious cycle that goes back who knows how far. And then throw into the pot social pressures, what you picked up at school, what friends, what you wanted to do to be liked, what you do right now to be accepted. So you have to start wondering, how can I even distinguish who I truly am? Well, that's why Abraham was told straight out, first step of all journeys, before any other journey. People looking for all kinds of things. We travel to find happiness, to find money, to find love. But the first journey of all is to find yourself. Because if you don't know who you are, nothing can compensate for that. So God tells Abraham, and this is really a commandment to all of us, the first thing is you have to know how to leave your influences behind. Even if they're positive ones. It still doesn't mean that's you. It just means they may have helped you reach this place. But now you have to find, who are you? What is your calling? What is your voice, your independent voice? It sounds great and it sounds like all of us would love it, but it's much harder to actualize than it sounds. As they say, easier said than done. Why is that? Number one is that same influences that you're trying to escape also influence you in your courage, whether you can even escape them. You get the trap. So your own subjectivity keeps you subjective, basically. Second thing is, there's a lot of fear around this. You may have insecurities. It's not an easy thing to just discover your calling. Sometimes it may not be as romantic and appealing, but it's just easier to just go along with what everyone else is doing. That's why they call it the road less traveled, because it's not the easier road to take. Why are there only very few real independent people in this world? If everybody was independent, it wouldn't be a virtue, it wouldn't be like a special thing everybody was doing. Because most people are conformists, not necessarily by temperament or by choice. Sometimes it's just the easier route. It's the one that is simplest. Why should you stand out? Why should you look different, think different? So we all like a taste of it, but are you ready to pay the price to truly be different? So when you ask people, as I said, everyone likes a certain glamorous part of it. They want to feel, I'm an individual. But individuality in its truest sense of the word comes with a heavy price. If you're truly going to live up to who you are. Well, that's why you don't have an Abraham every day. And that's why you don't have leaders that pioneer new ways all the time. And in many ways, many situations, especially in the world in which we live, actually leaders are more or less, every community usually gets the leaders it deserves. You can read into that as you see fit. So when God tells Abraham, go to the land I will show you, he's actually giving him the ultimate in essence of what the promised land is. It's much more than, as I said, a reward at the end of the what I want to say, the golden path. It's actually, the promised land means you finding yourself. You know, they tell the story of the Baal Shem Tov. One of his students once wanted to, this is like people on a spiritual journey aspire to find revelation. And one way it's expressed is called Gili Eliyahu, to discover and the revelation of Elijah the prophet, who manifests a certain type of spiritual revelation. So there are people in their history who have worked and prayed and exerted themselves and studied for hours and years on end to see Eliyahu, so to speak. It would be like seeing a deep spiritual revelation. So the Baal Shem Tov, who had a student who was in this on this journey, so the Baal Shem, he once came to the Baal Shem Tov, he says, where can I find Eliyahu? I want to have that experience. So the Baal Shem Tov sends him for the holiday. He says, holidays are coming up. Go to this in this town, this in this address, and there you'll find Eliyahu. You'll find this revelation, this spiritual mentor called Eliyahu. So he embarks on the road, on the journey. The Baal Shem Tov says, you know, he trusts him. He comes, it's the day before the holiday. He knocks on the door. As the door opens, he sees, wow, this is some house. He sees a house full of babies and children running around. Definitely a very impoverished home. The mother seems to be out of control. The father is just barely making it as chopping wood. And you know, he looks around. He doesn't see Eliyahu here exactly, but the Baal Shem Tov sent him here. So he asked them. He says, "Is there anywhere I can stay here?" So they said, "Not really. You know, this is a place we're full of children. We have no food. We have nothing." So he says, "Listen, if you maybe if you can find me a room, an extra room here, I'll buy all the food, and you'll have a holiday, and I'll be your guest," and so on. They were, of course, elated. That was an unexpected surprise because they were concerned where they're going to find enough to provide for the children and give them maybe buy them a new garment or something to make a little holiday feel. So here they had that. Anyway, that's what happened. He went out shopping, bought all the necessities, bought a few gifts, bought a few new pairs of shoes, clothing, and it was the greatest holiday they ever had. So for a family like that, this was like extraordinary. Meanwhile, he spent the holiday there. It was nice in that sense, but no great revelations took place. So he comes back after the holiday, back to town, back to the Baal Shem Tov, and the Baal Shem Tov says, "No, what happened?" He says, "It was a nice family and all that," and he explained what happened, but Eliyahu he didn't discover. So the Baal Shem Tov says to him, "I suggest you go back for the next holiday again." Okay, fine. So the next holiday comes, and he travels. He knows now where it is, and he's about to knock on the door, and he hears from behind the door. He's yelling and screaming. The children say, "We have nothing to eat." The father says, "What are we going to do for the holiday?" So the mother suddenly yells out. She says, "Maybe Eliyahu Navi will come again and buy everything for us." So he realized that sometimes the revelation that you're looking for is not some spiritual angel out there. It may be you, that you have it within you. That's what he discovered. It was right within himself, which is an unbelievable story, of course, and in a way epitomizes so much how Jewish mysticism works. It's not about sensational revelations, something that is going to get points for its sensation and glamour. It's about reality. And the Torah tells us that each of us has a promised land, and it's inside your heart and soul. Israel, the land of Israel, is a physical mirror of who you are, which is really what means when you come home. Some people go to Israel and they feel they've come home. What does that mean, you come home? What is it, the views? The sunset? The people? Hardly, right? What is it exactly? It's when you say I come home, I feel home. You feel like that's where you belong. There's something about it that makes you feel that this is you. And that is the essence of what the promised land truly is. So when God promised it to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it wasn't just about the land. You'll get a land. If it doesn't work out, you get a different land. It's not about that. It's about life and death. It's the destiny of a person's life. And that is why it is mentioned so many times in the Torah, and that is why Moses and everybody aspired so much to enter this land. The Talmud says, that Moses prayed and prayed, even after God said to him, you will not enter this land. He prayed 515 prayers. Only God could stop him. Finally God said to him, no more, you shouldn't pray anymore. In the chapter of Eschanon, later in the book of Deuteronomy, God stops him from praying. So the Talmud asks, what was he praying for? And the Talmud says in a very, if you know the Talmud has its own so-called like tongue-in-cheek expressions. And the Talmud says, what was he praying for? To go in and eat of the fruit of the land? Is that what Moses wanted? To have some juicy fruit? The Talmud says it. Did he want it for its fruit? And the Talmud says no, he wanted it for its mitzvahs. He wanted it because he knew that's where the ultimate spiritual destiny, spiritual heights that a person can reach can only be reached in this land. So it's the other way around. It's not that Israel is the land that has all these promises because of its deep spirituality, like the so-called the vortex, the center, where heaven meets earth. What did Jacob say when he fell asleep on this place, this holy place, the the Temple Mount, Holy of Holies? So it says when Jacob fell asleep and he had his famous dream, so he uses the expression Zeh Shar Shamayim. This is the gate to heaven. Some of you may have heard of the Shelach, great mystic, great sage, 16th century, 17th century, and he was a great rabbi in many of the big cities in Europe. And at the end of his life, as many, he also chose to travel to the Holy Land. And he arrived there. The last years of his life he spent in Israel, and that's where he discovered the writings of the Arizal and so on, and he writes about it. He composed a siddur, a prayer book. And because he composed it when he arrived to Israel, he called it Shar HaShamayim, the gate to heaven, based on the verse of Jacob, in suggesting that this was the reason he came here. So Jacob, in 2 words, this gate to heaven. Now, gate to heaven doesn't just mean heaven in the sense of, like I said, reward. The gate to heaven means the heaven within all of us. It's the gate to your soul. It's the gate to it's a place where there are less layers that separate material life from the spiritual roots. Just to explain that, for those of you who may need some explanation, the way the Torah, especially the way the Kabbalah explains existence, the material existence that we see with our naked eyes, that we experience with our senses, with our sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell, is only the tip of the iceberg. So just like if someone touches this table, we know that within this table is not just a table. This table is made up of elements, which are made up in turn of molecules, and molecules of atoms, and atoms of subatomic particles, and subatomic particles of many other more microscopic particles, many of which we don't even know about. So when you touch this table, what are you touching? What is this? Is it a table? It's a table in the ostensible sense. On this level, it's a table. We put things on this table. But in essence, if you really want to define its chemistry, you have to include everything that it's made up of. So the mystics will take it one step further, that the table truly is spiritual energy. And that spiritual energy manifests in subatomic particles, in turn in atoms, molecules, elements, until we have the end product, or the tip of the iceberg. What is the tip of an iceberg, literally? You look at the tip, it's just sticking out of the water, and if you follow down underwater, you discover a mountain. Icebergs are mountains of ice. They're not the little tip. So to the eye, it just looks like a tip. The same as everything. Look at water. Anything protruding out of water seems deceptively small or simple. If we never went underwater, if we never had camera crews to see the fascinating undersea world, underwater world, right? Get the idea. You see, this is the advantage of being here live. that you can help correct me, because on the web, people who get frustrated with, they want to give me the words, you can't say that. So you have to come here if you want to give your input for now. It's just a plug for the live class, okay. I don't want to lose the audience. Everyone will just sit there. I'll be sitting here talking to a camera. So that's not connected to what I was discussing. Okay, so if you have your train of thought, let's go back to the tip of the iceberg. That if you were unable to see what was going on beneath the surface, the sea looks deceptively simple. I mean, once in a while you see a fish jumping out, you see waves, you see power, but who will know what's underneath there? And even today, with all of that we know also so little about the deep depths of the sea. And it's continuously being discovered. And we know today that it's much more complicated than life on land. The Talmud said it long ago, that everything that exists on land exists in the sea. Both creatures and also mountains and valleys and volcanoes. Did you know that I think every 3 seconds there's an earthquake on Earth? But most of them are in the sea. So it doesn't affect us, at least directly. We see a tsunami, and you suddenly realize the enormous power of what's going on beneath the water. I'm using this simply as an example, that never think your perceived reality is even 1% of reality. So with that being said, think about yourself now. What does your inner space look like? And how much do you know of it? So the promise that God made to Abraham, go to the land I will show you, who you are, is the greatest promise one can make. As a matter of fact, if it was just the promise of a land, you'd wonder, what's so great about this land? What's this big promised land? Well, it's nice to have a land that's yours, place to build, especially today with all the controversy around Israel and who owns it. But is that ultimately what God was telling Abraham? I'm giving you a physical piece of geography? So the answer is no, it's the other way around. Israel is the gate to heaven. Basically, material existence, as I said, is a tip of the iceberg, even less than that. It has an enormous amount of unfathomable layers and layers and layers. And putting in the mystical, Kabbalistic terminology, what we see is the container. And within it lies tremendous amounts of light and energy. Iris and Kalim, if you want the original language in Kabbalistic thought. Sometimes it goes even more than that. It's not just we're containers, but the containers themselves are covered up in containers. So it's layers of containers. Imagine containers upon containers, peels upon peels. And then you hear the expression often also from Kabbalistic terminology, klipa. The idea of a klipa. Klipa means a husk, a shell. So take an orange peel, a potato peel, an eggshell. These are all klipot. Some are hard. In the Kabbalah you have hard klipot, you have very hard, like for example a walnut. So it's that's a hard klip. Some are very thin, like the skin of an olive or of a grape. Some are barely transparent. So there are different layers of klipot. Basically, what's the meaning of klipa, as the Shelach actually explains? A klipa simply means it's a covering that covers what's inside of it. Now, in the case of a fruit, actually the container is very healthy. The peel of a fruit or the shell of an egg protects it. It's a protective layer. It protects it. Okay. It's all right. You don't have to tiptoe. So why then do the Kabbalists refer to it as klipa as like, and we say klipa, usually say that comes from the world of klipot, referred almost like something negative and even evil? The answer is a fascinating answer. A peel is not evil at all. It's actually good. It's healthy. It protects the fruit. When can it become something negative? When you forget that there's a fruit inside and you focus only on the peel. So in true klipa itself has dual, it's really up to us. It's our choice. So imagine you find an orange and you decide to worship the peel and never open it. That's like living on the level of the peel, so to speak. Forgetting that the peel is only there to protect that which is within. This is essentially when a person lives his life, her or her life, worshipping the means and forgetting the end. This happens every day. I don't know if anybody in this room suffers from that problem, but it's basically the problem of 99.9% of the world, if not 100%. Where essentially you're so consumed with the means, that becomes, the peel, becomes more important than what it leads to. So when you have that type of ironic statement, which most people don't even see as ironic, where parents are not there for their children, with an explanation that we're working so hard for our children. So explain that one. The children need you now for love and nurturing. And you're working all day and all night, and meanwhile they're not getting the love. Why? Because you're going to make enough money to do what? That when they're retired and you're retired, you'll give them love. Love is most necessary in the youngest age. Now I'm not here, this is not a criticism of two what are they called? Two job homes, two career homes, whatever it's called. Two working parents. You know, we want to make ends meet, but it's just a point that's a social, let's call it a little social sarcasm. Meaning that many of us do things in the name of something we want to achieve, and while we're doing that, we're destroying what we want to achieve. This also is not that very uncommon. Why? Because in the world, with our myopic vision, we can get so consumed with the peels and forget the fruit within. So for some people, maybe John Lennon's line is the best, that life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans. Okay. So he doesn't say it necessarily the way the Kabbalists put it, but the Kabbalists would say it's living on the level of the peel, the means, as opposed to the end. Does that mean we shouldn't have means? No, we should have means. It's a matter of perspective. And this is common in many, many areas. This could happen in business, it could happen in your personal life. And sadly, most of us are on that level because, number one, we're not necessarily trained to even look for the fruit or to even know that it's there. As I said, how much time do we even have to focus on finding your inner self? So the first promise of all that God makes to Abraham, and that's why it's called Promised Land, is that you have it within you. And if you allow, and if you shed the layers of your so-called preconceived notions and your subjectivity, the things that have shaped your life, this promised land will emerge. So go to the land that I will show you who you really are. But to do that requires you have to get rid of the other things that you may think you are. In other words, as long as you're living in some type of delusion of who you are, that is your identity, you're never going to find a truer identity. Now this isn't an easy process. How does an adult like us, like any of us, at least a chronological adult, who has already developed a sense of identity, and we think this is who we are, how do you suddenly in midlife, with a job and family and friends and then all kinds of commitments and responsibilities, suddenly say to yourself, well, maybe this isn't my identity in the first place? Now usually this question is asked only when we encounter some trauma in our lives. When something happens that shakes us up, this is usually the first question. I don't know if it's the first question, but it's one of the questions. You start saying, who am I? What have I done? In other words, usually failure or some type of shock or some type of transition brings out this question in us. Much fewer people will ask this question when there's no particular event that generates it. But it's the healthy question to ask, and any true seeker always asks this question. Now this doesn't mean that you have to spend your life only asking questions and being unsure of who you are by keeping asking, maybe this is not who I am. But it means it's about being sober and brutally honest about certain things in your life. As I said, most of us will go embark on this journey when things aren't working and we are essentially hit rock bottom or something else of that nature that forces us to go look. You know? And it's for good or for bad, I constantly meet people who come to me, and it's usually when they come is when like last week someone came to see me. She was in love with someone, he was in love with her, and then after 4 years he left her. So of course there's all the pain and all that, but it all comes down to you start questioning yourself. What did I do? What's wrong? But once you get beyond that, it really comes down to what your choice is. Was I living in a dream? Was this an illusion? Who am I? And it's very difficult to tell someone in pain and it's a period of mourning or grief over something that you got to find your identity. It's a nice philosophical statement, but it doesn't work when someone is hurting. So you have to be, of course, compassionate and just sometimes hold somebody's hand in the sense where you support their journey until the point comes where a person can begin to think and look. But it takes a lot of strength to maintain not the grief, but the awareness that comes through grief, and that awareness of like a wake-up call, and say, okay, maybe it's time to relook at my whole life. Most of us do not access our promised land. That's the fact. So is this a sad statement to say that most of us have betrayed our promised land? Yes, it is. But obviously this class is not going to end on that note. That wouldn't be very good idea, I think, because you don't need me to tell this to you, or maybe you do, but I'm not here to tell you the problem. The key is to find the solution, of course. As we know, half the cure, as they say, Yediyas hamach lechetzi refuah, the awareness of an illness is half its cure. So the story of this week's chapter, where the scouts betray the promised land, even though it sounds, how could they have done such a thing? God promised it, and they knew they were on this journey, and God had taken them out of Egypt and saw miracles. So how suddenly did they doubt? So if you ever try to judge them, think about your own promised land and see what you've betrayed. So that's number one. They can identify. So what was it with the scouts? What exactly did happen? What happened was what happens to everybody. That when you hit reality, you stop seeing or believing necessarily in the promise. Now in the case of the scouts, it happens to be, as we analyze their motivation, which I will discuss in a few minutes, there are unbelievable lessons that we can learn, and that's why the story is told to us. The Torah is not coming to tell us a story about people 3,319 years ago, or 18 years ago, who just betrayed the promised land, and they were punished, and they were not allowed into the land, and because of that we have the destruction of the temple. The Torah is coming to tell us that we can identify with these people and not do what they did, and learn from what their mistakes were. So the first thing, the story needs to be looked at as a lesson. Not what to do, but understand what caused them to lose that type of faith. So the question is even deeper than that, because if you think about it, the scouts were not simple people. If you look at the beginning of the chapter, Moses happened to choose the best of the best, the cream of the crop. These were the leaders of Israel. The 12 leaders, each one of their respective tribe. So he chose the best. Moses chose them. And sent them, they come back with this report. So what is this? Moses made a mistake? He chose the wrong people? What should he have done? Choose the simplest ones? Sometimes, choose the scholars is not always the wisest thing to do. And above all, if you read the chapter, you also see it says, Shelach lecha anoshim. What does lecha mean? You shall send unto you. Moses, God tells Moses, you shall send unto you, meaning send it at your own initiative. As Rashi explains, that Moses turned to God and said, should I send the scouts? And God said, this is your decision, it's not about me. Which is a very almost bizarre statement. The whole Torah is about the word of God. Moses keeps turning to God, and God said this and God said that. V'daber Hashem al Moshe lemer. He tells him to do this and this commandment, that commandment. The whole Torah is about God's commandments. And suddenly, here's a statement. God says, don't ask me, do it as you wish. So shlach lecha l'daitecha. Moses sends it at his initiative. As soon as God told him that, it should have raised a red flag. He should have said, oh, this is trouble. God's telling him to do it on his own. That means that God doesn't want to take responsibility, so why would he? And it actually turns out not the way, God was right. It's your problem, not mine. And obviously that was not God's intention, trying to not be accountable. But what is the meaning of it? And why are we told all of this? And it says, as Rashi says, at the time they went, they did not have any malicious intentions. They were kosher in their intentions. That meant that they intended to do exactly as Moses asked them to do. It was not planned that they would come with such a report. So it was all. So what happened here? What kind of failure, mechanical failure, took place? And since I'm asking questions, I might as throw in another question or two, if I may. And that is, what exactly was their sin also? Didn't Moses send them to come back with a report? Moses didn't tell them come back with a good report. He told them come back with a report. What's going on in Israel? So they came back and they said it's a land that consumes its inhabitants. It's full of giants. We can't go to war. What's wrong with that? If you hire scouts to go scout out a situation, they come back to you and tell you it's terrible. That's why you hire them. If you only want to hear a good report, why send them? Then just they don't have to go. They can just write up a good report and they'll rubber stamp whatever you want. So what was the problem? And another question. And finally another question. If you look at the Haftarah of this week, the Haftarah is always of the same theme of the chapter. And the Haftarah, you'd think that everyone learned their lesson. No, Joshua decides he's also going to send scouts. Didn't he already see what happens when you send scouts? It doesn't always turn out the way you like. And Moses himself in the later chapter, in a few chapters from here, also sent scouts again. So clearly there's a lot more going on here than meets the eye. And all these questions, as you'll see in a moment, all about our lives. It's all about our betrayal of the promised land. And the answer to these questions is the answer how we get beyond ourselves as well, in our own betrayals. So let's go back to the actual story. What's going on is the following. The story of life is that we have free will, and that God provides us resources, and yes, and provides us commandments and guidelines, but ultimately there are many things that we're blessed with that we have to use our own initiative. Had God wanted puppets, He wouldn't have created us with minds and hearts, discerning minds and feeling hearts, and would just, as it is in the animal kingdom, set in motion a clockwork of mechanisms that drive nature. In our case, He blessed us with a mind, and with a heart, and with the ability to make decisions. So now God said, I gave you the promised land. I took you out of Egypt. Now march toward the promised land. Now Moses understood that the process is a partnership here. It's not just depending on God. Everyone knows the classic story has been told 1,000 times, but the guy has so much faith that he doesn't allow himself to be saved. You know the story, right? The city is just flooding, everybody's running, and this guy's is saying no, he's waiting for God to save him. So finally, the water reaches up to his neck. I'm just making the long story short. A helicopter comes by, throwing him a ladder. No, he's waiting for God to save him. Anyway, the water's already over his head. Another time the helicopter comes. And a third time. What happens? He drowns. And of course he comes running up to the pearly gates and marching into God's chamber and says, I was the only one that trusted you. Everyone else ran for their lives and they trusted humans and other resources. And I trusted you. How did you let me down? So God said, I sent you a helicopter 3 times. What do you want? And this is just one example of the story. God blesses you in your actions. So if you ask in a prayer for a shidduch, for a soulmate, or for a job, and then you go to sleep, the blessing may be answered, but you decided to not be there to receive it. Or if you ask for something and then you come with a container that has holes in it, or no pockets, how are you going to contain it? So together with our trust in God has to also come with using our intelligence to create the right containers. We do the best we can, and then we rely on the rest on God. So it's a partnership, 2 ways. Like in anything, God provides the resource, but you have to resources, and we have to develop them. So Moses understood this fully well. So when he said to God, when he thought about what do we do, how do we enter the promised land, he knew God had given us the promised land. Now it's up to you to figure out how to go. So he knew that he had to do it at his initiative, and knew fully well there's a big risk involved, because when you do it with humans, anything could happen. But Moses was a man of courage, and he was not going to cower or retreat because a mistake can happen. That's life. And life is engaging life with its risks. So he chose the 12 best that he could choose, all using his discretion, and he would do it again even though it happened, because they made a choice. And what was their sin was not that they came back with a report. That's fine. They could have come back with a report. They added one fatal sentence, that we can't do it. No one asked you. You were hired to give a report. No one asked you whether you can do it or not. Just tell us how to do it. They got involved in the area that was not their domain. The decision whether you travel, whether you conquer the land or not. And that's the equivalent. We're given life and we're blessed with resources. But we never have the right to ask, why should we be alive? Because we didn't create life. That doesn't come from us. We're on a mission. The question is, what best way to do it? How to do it, not whether to do it. And that's the partnership. That's why in Judaism, suicide is considered a sin. You could say, well, it's my life. What do I... Let's say you have no relatives, no one's hurt. Why can't you hurt yourself? For that matter, even self-mutilation is a sin. You're not even allowed to mutilate your finger. So the commentaries explain why. Because it's not your property. Did you create your own body and your soul? It was given to you as a gift. So protect it. Your job is to figure out the best way to use it in this world. To walk into the domain of God is what the Nazis did. They decided who deserves to live, who doesn't deserve to live. With all the rationale in the world. It's not the domain of human beings. So the scouts went into that was their mistake. And that Moses knew. It's possible. He hoped it wouldn't happen, but that's what happened. They were too smart for themselves. The Kabbalists, the Hasidic masters, explain something even more profound. The scouts were actually great tzaddikim. You know why they didn't want to enter the promised land? What do they mean, it's a land that consumes its inhabitants? Did they lose faith that we can conquer enemies? They were not cowards. So you know what the Kabbalah says? It says that the scouts were spiritual people. And they didn't want to enter into the challenges of a material life. They wanted to remain in the spiritual domain. Do you hear this? And that was their sin. Their sin was not because they were indulgent. They said, "Oh, we want to be selfish and we want to live hedonistic lives." It was the exact opposite. They were too spiritual for their own good, which means they decided it's much more comfortable to stay here in the wilderness, protected by God's clouds, getting food from heaven. Why should we have to leave the yeshiva, the kollel, and go out into a harsh world? It's a land that consumes its inhabitants. So in a strange way, their sin was the exact. They thought they were going to be godly, and meanwhile they defied God's mission, which is, I want you down on earth. I don't want you in heaven with me. If I want you in heaven, then I wouldn't send your soul down to this earth. And that was their sin. That was the mistake. So how does that all apply to us? It applies to us because the bottom line is the betrayal of the promised land. What was their mistake was that they got their egos in the way. Yes, in their case it happened to be spiritual egos. They decided what is promised land for themselves. So the first and foremost lesson, if you want to discover yourself, is you don't decide who you are. How do you like that? Most people would say the opposite. You want to discover yourself is go for a big journey, aggressive journey to find out who you are. But you will find out who you are as soon as you stop focusing on yourself. That's the big lesson. Now what does that mean? I'll explain. We grow up, and this is maybe where we are our own worst enemies. The tools that we've learned to master are the worst tools to use when it comes to self-discovery. They're great tools for finding a job, for beating the competition, for being a marketing expert, for taking care of your material needs. But they're terrible tools to discover your soul. And let me explain. We're taught in this world that if you want to get something, you have to go out and get it. You want a loaf of bread, you have to go out to a bakery and buy it. You want a job, you have to interview, network, whatever it is. Because if you're not going to do it, no one's going to do it for you. I know some people have to go to 12 years of school and then another 6 or 8 years of graduate school to find that out, this lesson. Some of us just learn it from the streets. This is all true in a materialistic, when you're talking about material gain. When you're talking about things like finding love, or finding your soul, or finding your destiny, your calling, these tools are the worst tools you can use. but we use them all the time because that's how we're trained. What tools are the ones that are most powerful to use in self-discovery? Above all, the tool is called bittul. Bittul means suspension of self. Suspension of everything you know about yourself. As God told Abraham, suspend your past and then you'll discover your true self. Because if you bring all those tools with you, then it's just whatever you discover is a product of those tools. You're back to square one. It's all about how you perceive yourself. It's not opening yourself up to another perspective. So if we were to shut down our five senses, your eyes, your ears, touch and smell, what would you be left with? Try it out. Close your eyes, your ears, your taste, touch, and smell. Leave your ears open a little so I can speak, so you can hear what I'm saying. What are you left with? Maybe this exercise you can do on your own at some point. It's a good Shabbos exercise, as you'll see in a moment. What are you left with? Not an easy thing to really do in the first place. So initially, the prospect may even seem a little terrifying. You're going to disappear. You know, if I can't see or hear or taste, touch, and smell, that means there's no internet, there's no television, there's no friends to talk to. You're left with what? You're left with you. The you, real you. Why? Because you don't need eyes to see yourself, right? You don't need ears to hear yourself. You don't need taste, touch, and smell to experience yourself. If you really think about it, all the senses that are so hyper-stimulated in our modern society are all about everything except you. What are eyes? To see others, and others can see you. Ears to hear others, and the same with taste, touch, and smell. Now maybe there are some people that need to look in the mirror to discover what they look like. But it's really because we want to know how the world looks at us, right? There was a Hasidic Rebbe who was a very holy man, and he never looked in the mirror in his whole life because it's considered an act of vanity for people on that level. I wouldn't begin that journey if that's what you're looking to be spiritual. Don't start with that. There are other things to do first before you get to that stage. But that's where he was at. And someone once showed him a picture of, guess who? Of him. Now, since he never saw himself, he didn't know who it was. So he said, this is what he said. They say this about the old Belzer Rebbe. I haven't confirmed it, but they say about it. He says, Ahelik Eid, a holy Jew. That's what he said when he saw the picture. And didn't know it was himself. So when you get to that point, we'll talk, you know. I'm not there either, so I have seen myself in the mirror, and I've seen myself on the internet too. So it's one of the levels. The point I'm making is there are people that have got to that place. To be so secure and comfortable with yourself that you don't have to see yourself means that you know yourself without the look, so to speak. So non-self-conscious. Is anybody here not self-conscious, if I may ask? You know, ever met anyone that's not self-conscious? And I don't mean in the extreme sense. You know, of course there are people who are extremely self-conscious all the time. Most of us learn how to hide it. So, you know, you feel comfortable. And there are, of course, levels of it. But not being self-conscious is a very difficult thing. You know why it's difficult? Because we are essentially a composite of two parts of ourselves. There's the real you. Uh-oh. The debate begins about whether to make it higher or lower. Why don't you ask the men? Okay. Catherine, you do things unilaterally. This is a democratic society here, okay? Next time we put it up for a vote. Okay. What about out there on the web? They can vote as well. They're probably all sitting in the comfort of it. Anyway, so self-conscious. I once wrote a long article about it connected to the chapter about the loss of innocence from Adam and Eve. The reason we are self-conscious is because we're conscious. What I mean by that is we're not in touch with our real self. We're conscious of ourselves. As soon as you're conscious of yourself, you're not really your real you. And I'll give you an example. What is your left foot doing a second before I just mentioned it? None of you knew. Does it mean that it wasn't there? it means it was completely there. It's so much there that you don't have to feel it. What does life feel like? Tell me, what does it feel like to be healthy? If you tell me what it feels like, that's already a problem. Sensations are not a good sign. If someone starts saying, this is what I feel, then it's usually a symptom of something. Because to breathe normally and to be healthy means you don't feel it. It means it's just there. It's a state of being where you just are. It's a noun, not a verb. Let's put it that way. As soon as life is a verb, you're already not there. Which is why John Stuart Mill wrote that happiness only comes to people who don't make that their objective. Anyone searching for happiness will never truly be happy. The happy people are doing things that as a result, they just are happy people. Because happiness is not a commodity that you can buy, nor rent, nor read a book and you're going to suddenly be happy. A good book may touch a chord inside of you that learns to live that way. But it's not some gimmick that it's going to work. And the best proof of it is, look, all the books that promise happiness continue to be bestsellers. Like, where's the one that made everybody happy? Why do they continue to sell? So, we live in a world of commodity, and we've been trained to think that you have to get something to have it. The attitude that you have it already, and you have to almost like shut down all your senses to get it, is something that's counterintuitive to most of us. But it happens to be the secret to all true peace, inner peace. The people who have the ability to sit quietly and are comfortable in their own skin are in that place. They have that type of confidence. The senses are there, but they never worship their senses. They don't need their senses to define for them and navigate what is right and wrong. Does everybody in this room have that capacity? Absolutely. But the first step is you have to learn that you're doing things that are not that way, and you have to learn to stop that. Simple as that. So, in a sense, to discover inner identity, or our promised land, is really letting go, not becoming more aggressive. The Scouts are an excellent example because they did it in the name of God, in the name of soul. They wanted to live a soulful life. What do we need this materialistic world, which consumes its inhabitants? We want to stay in a soulful dimension. What was their mistake? It was no one asked you. It's not about you and your interests. Even if your interests are the most pure, that's not where mission, that's not where your calling comes from. Your calling comes from suspending yourself and surrendering really to a higher will. Now that word surrender, I know, and I rarely use it for this reason, evokes very bad images in most people's mind. And as you know, I'm very careful with words like that because, the example I've always given early years when this class began, I remember people sitting in the class, or Philip will remember, people from the arts and music industry, and many of them, as they openly acknowledged, said, that we're not traditional Jews. Their spirituality came, as they would share with me, from Zen Buddhism, from a thing called LSD, and so on. So I realized that before I even opened my mouth, I was at a disadvantage because I'm sitting with people who may look at me as stereotype me as one of these ultra-orthodox, right-wing, from a Woody Allen movie or something. And I decided to do an experiment, which was, instead of using words that I knew that would evoke all kinds of imagery and stereotypes, instead of God, I used the word higher reality, or essence. Oh, that was good. Essence of it all. Essence. And particularly more New Age group, I would say the cosmic undefined layers of energy or something like that. Unconscious energy. And instead of Torah, I used the word blueprint. And instead of mitzvahs, connections. And instead of Mashiach Geula, I used destination. So here I was talking about this journey to the essence of everything, using connections and a blueprint and reaching the destinations. And everybody was listening. Wow, they thought this was unbelievable. And after a few weeks, a guy came over and asked me whether I was talking about God. And I said, yes, but shh, don't spoil it for the others. That was the story. It's a true story. It happened. And I learned a deep lesson from that, which was that even though we like to look at language as a tool to communicate and connect each other, language can also be a barrier that separates us. Because words are loaded. So when I say the word God, what does it mean? Everybody has your own image of God. So I start saying God, if I don't explain what I mean, you're all going to use the assumption whatever you think God is, and it may not be the God that I'm trying to talk about. Like the Levi Yitzchak Berditchever, who said, the God you don't believe in, I also don't believe in. He told this to an atheist. So the word surrender is a very dangerous word today, because surrender evokes loss of identity, annihilation of you. You're surrendering to someone else. In war you don't surrender. Surrender is the weaker side. The loser surrenders. You could say in the millennia, people surrendered their free choice to the church or to some other autocratic authority. These are not, so that doesn't conjure up images, healthy images. But I specifically used the word because I knew I was going to explain it, and I'm explaining it by saying there is also called healthy surrender. Not all surrender is negative. Just like the guy who said, just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean no one wants to get me. Not just because it's surrender doesn't mean it's negative. Which means, basically, there is a surrender that a person with confidence has the ability to, and the word I would really use is suspend yourself. In true love. Not surrender as it's used in contemporary terms. In true love, there's a need to suspend yourself. And that's when love can really be accessed. Because if it's all about you and an extension of your own needs, then it's going to be completely conditional by your needs. Your needs are met, there's love. They're not met, there's no love. They're met halfway, there's half love. Very similar to a business contract. When it comes to total love, when it comes to total soul, it's always dependent on the level of a person's surrender. Now, what are you surrendering? Not surrendering yourself. We're not talking about annihilation or self-destructive or a dysfunctional form of surrender where you lose your identity in the face of someone else. That's not healthy. What we're talking about is that you have the courage and the confidence, and you are secure enough with who you are that you don't have to hold on to every position that you have. You don't have to hold on to every decision you've made, to every opinion you have. It's the ability to suspend the self in order to assume a greater self. Which is the greater self? Your promised land. The scouts couldn't do it because they were too spiritual. And most of us can't do it because we're too material. But it's all about you. Your identity is always in the way of your own ultimate potential. That's why it's such a trap. Because it's your identity. It's not someone else blocking you. It's you're blocking it based on self-perception. So how do you get beyond that? So I always like to tell the Chelem story right around here. It's perfect. Fits in. How's the weather, Catherine, there by you? Good. Temperature rising. But I'm doing the speaking, so it's not a good sign. You have to ask others. So, the story of Chelem, the farmer of Chelem. Chelem, just to give you a little introduction, can I introduce you to the world of Chelem? Just like we have a promised land inside of us, we also have a Chelem inside each of us. Chelem is that absurd place where we do absurd things. And we maybe can laugh, we can cry, whatever it is. So Chelem. So Chelem was an actual town in Poland that they say had actually very intelligent people there, but the neighbors were very resentful, so they created this whole folklore of these Chelem jokes. But they end up giving actually a very interesting insight, psychological insights. And I've seen them even creep into modern therapy and modern healing. So you have a lot of these Chelem metaphors. Like the classic one that I recently read, you may have heard of it. But it's used in therapy a lot, how people solve problems. I'll get back to my Chelem farmer one in a moment. But there's a lot of them. They're, if you apply them to yourself, you can see the wisdom. So it goes like this. The one with how do you problem solving, right? So a guy's looking for his keys in the dark, outside. He's looking. His friend comes by and asks him, what are you looking for? He says, I'm looking for my keys. He says, well, where did you lose them? And he points to like 200 yards away. So why aren't you looking there? He says, because here's where the light is shining. So, sounds like a fool, but this is what most of us do. We look, there's a light shining, that's where you look. You don't necessarily look where you should be looking. because it may be too uncomfortable. Read into it as you see. So the Chelm farmer, Chelm was a small town, so the farm on Chelm was even smaller, of course. But this was a very special farm to him, because he had inherited it from his parents and his grandparents. It goes back generations, so it was his baby, as they say. And he knew every grain of soil in this farm. One day, he gets a letter that a guest is arriving to town. It's his cousin. His cousin is coming from the United States. A big town farmer from Texas is coming to see him. Okay, the day comes, and he shows him around. He gives him the royal Chelm tour of his farm. And they look, okay, they sit down to dinner. So what do you think, cousin, about my farm here in Chelm? He was so proud. So his cousin says to him, yeah, it's very nice and cute, but it's so tiny. So his cousin gets insulted. What do you mean it's so tiny? How big is your farm in Texas? So how is a Texan farmer going to explain to a Chelm farmer the size of his farm? You know. So he says, well, to give him a point of reference, he says, my farm, it takes me all day to travel with my tractor from one end of the farm to the next. That was his way of giving him. So the Chelm farmer suddenly feels sad and empathy for his cousin. He says to him, cousin, don't feel bad. I once had a tractor like that too. Think about it. It deserves a laugh, but it may be delayed. We were going to put, but with push, right? Yeah. Now, what happened here? The Chelm farmer was not malicious, but if we would say was he objective? He was also objective. But if I were to pass out here a questionnaire and ask everyone in this room and online, are you objective or subjective? Are you narrow-minded, closed-minded, or open-minded? I hardly believe that very few people would mark the box, I'm closed-minded, narrow-minded, and subjective. Because one of the virtues of subjectivity is it makes you think you're objective. Virtues, quote-unquote. But we are only as objective as our perspective allows us. Anyone that makes a statement, I am objective, without qualification, is either a fool or doesn't know what the word objective means. Objective, nobody is completely objective. There's no such thing. Are you objective if you only have 2 facts out of 1,000? You may not be biased in the sense where you're intentionally trying to distort anything. You just don't have any information. This farmer in Chelm didn't have a point of reference. He couldn't fathom such a size. So when he heard it takes a tractor to travel from one end to the next, so he was convinced it must be the tractor. He once also had a shmata jalopy like that took him all day to crank up to go from here to here. If you don't have the scope, imagination that a farm can be that large, you're never going to assume it's the size. You're going to assume it's something else. And if we all lived in Chelm, we probably would have agreed with the Chelm farmer. So it's all about perspective. It's all about what you know or what you're exposed to. So if you ever think that you had it all figured out, remember this story. We all are farmers on Chelm. The only question is how big our farms are. Just like the patent officer in 1898, United States patent officer resigned, saying, why did he resign? His job, he thought, was no longer needed, because everything that could be discovered has been discovered. Now some say this is a myth. It doesn't matter. It sounds good. In 1898, everything that could be discovered was discovered. Would anyone say that in 2008? Why not? We know much more than then. Now we could definitely say, 1898, there was no automobile and no airplane, and definitely not atomic energy, and Einstein had not come up on the scene yet, and definitely not quantum mechanics, and everything we have today, computers and cellular technology and fax and the whole thing. But today, hey, we've discovered it, but no one's going to say that any longer. Not only because we realize he was wrong, because the more you know, the more you see the farm is quite large. and it could be a lot larger than anyone will ever imagine. So wisdom actually helps you surrender. It helps you suspend yourself, not the opposite. Now, wisdom that causes you to be more arrogant, many would argue is not wisdom. That's your arrogance just hiding behind wisdom. So truth, love, soul, everything that's real and permanent is always conditional upon one thing: suspending yourself. If you can't do that, you're never going to access those. You may have a taste of it, you may manipulate your way in for a short period of time, but it never will last. When you see parents and children remembering parents at Yizkor, for example, you see generations that pass. What is that endured over generations? What endured was the ability to go beyond yourself. How do you think the Jews survived the Holocaust? Those that survived, how could they have in any way remained sane and build families? Because as much as they were consumed by grief, they transcended even that. They knew there was obligation, there was responsibility, there was a bigger picture. So I say to you like this: if you want to discover your promised land, or transcend the betrayal of your promised land, and we all have betrayed it. It may not have been a malicious act, it may not have been intentional, like you got up and just betrayed your promised land. It may have been simply neglect, not even believing in yourself, not even knowing you have it. But tonight you no longer have that excuse. I came here to tell you that you all have a promised land. So you can choose not to believe it. That's your call. I won't be insulted. Or you can choose to believe it and say, okay, so what do I do now? And what I say is that we all have the ability, no matter where you are in your life, to reclaim. First thing is you must believe that it's there. And we believe it's there by virtue that we were given life, not we gave ourselves life. It's a blessing that we were given. We were sent to this earth with a soul, and only one way, and only one thing justifies that being sent here: that you have something indispensable to offer this world. That means you have your promised land within you. It's inside your soul, it's there all the time. The question now is, how often do you care, or do you give it attention? How often do you acknowledge it? So the first step to begin is all of us have to find time, whether it's every morning when we say Moda'ani, right, when you wake up and acknowledge it, or it's other moments in the day. If you do not commit real time, it makes no difference what you believe. Then there's nothing to act on. The key is to make real time where you act on this promised land. This can mean initiating a class in your home or in your office. It can mean commitment to charity. But the key is consistency. It can be a commitment to learning. It can be a commitment to once a month hosting something at home, like a Shabbos dinner or something like that. There's 1,000 ways to go. I'll give you, the list goes on. But it's commitment. And whatever commitment you made till now is not enough. That's the bottom line. It means you have to do more, and you have to be aware that this is the way you allow your promised land to emerge. Now we have many, many reasons and excuses, and there are many resistances. Mostly it's habit. It's our past habits. So this is a choice we have to make. Are we going to be trapped by the past or not? So I'm not suggesting a cold turkey approach where you just begin anew, the whole past is gone. I don't believe that those things work. It all begins very small, but consistent. Consistent, meaning it's every day, it's every week, it doesn't change. No matter what, this must continue. The more you feed that part of your soul, the more powerful your promised land manifests and takes hold. And usually we talk about the 3 pillars like Torah, Avodah, Milas Chasadim, which means study, prayer, and acts of kindness. So usually it requires those 3 at least, something in each one of those categories. As I said, consistent, that's how you access the promised land. If you talk about a psychological mindset, be ready to suspend yourself. That's a critical component. A good exercise to suspend yourself is find someone you trust. I know that's going to be difficult, but let's say you could, and present to them your life. Present to them your perspective on something, and see if you have the courage to hear someone disagree with you that you trust. That's the key. If you cannot accept someone disagreeing with you, then you can rest assured that you are in your own way. Now this doesn't mean, of course we'll always say, how can anyone understand me better than I understand myself? very nice, but remember, you don't have the objectivity. So someone else may not fully understand you, but they can give you another perspective. And I find that that's a very healthy exercise. I try to employ it myself, to be honest. Many times I have a certain way of looking, and I like to, and even though it may not be always comfortable, but you want to hear from another person and allow them to give them the right. Tell them, I'm not looking for you to say yes. I'm looking to hear what you have to say. Just that exercise itself is a pretty good Chelem farmer exercise, and we may graduate from Chelem to I guess to some a little bigger shtetl. Which city? Okay, the Klimovich. There's a lot of cities, and there's many cities to grow toward. So I want to wish everybody the following: week of the Promised Land. The story is not meant to be one of betrayal; it's meant one to be of discovery. But by looking and hearing what they betrayed, it helps us look at ourselves. And yes, as young people, we may have certain potential you've given up on yourself. But remember, it's only you that has given up, not God, and not the promise is there. Will we access it? That's the question. And to reach to others, allow others to help you, because we need each other. It's not easy to do on our own. So, in that spirit, I'd like to also say this class was dedicated by our good friend Mark in honor of the outside of your uncle, Yankel ben Menachem Mendel, on the 14th of Sivan, wedding anniversary of your parents, may they be well, and father's birthday, Nachum Chaim ben Sarah Golda, 18th of Sivan. And as I said, please look at myself and my organization, Meaningful Life Center, and all the resources we try to provide as your allies. And if you have any questions, things that I've not addressed here tonight completely, or you want to get more, there's always more. Hopefully this tonight create more questions than answers. It's always a good sign. And questions that bother you is even better. So you always feel free to email me. My email is very accessible at meaningfullife.com. And if you haven't left your email, I'll be happy to take it, and we'll send you weekly articles. I'm now, as I said, just began a series of the 42 journeys of our life, which complements some of the discussion here. And remember, reclaim your promised land. That's the key. So everyone have a very good night. Thank you very much.